Hello, viewers, and welcome to the latest episode of The Huddle. Tim Poole here, editor of Gambling Insider, and in this episode, we'll be speaking with Poole, Sculpher, and Kirsty, Caldwell about the prospect of rising UK gambling taxes. The UK government is looking to plug a gap of 22 billion, and recent think tank reports suggested doubling remote gaming duty from 21% to 42%, and betting duty for land-based firms from 15% to 30% could be a good way to raise around £1 billion a year for the UK economy. Let's see what Poole and Kirsty have to say. I'm here with Kirsty Caldwell, founder and CEO of Betsmart Consulting, and Poole Sculpher, director of GRS. Thanks both for joining us. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of interesting debate here. To start off with, Kirsty, from an online gaming perspective, what we're here to talk about, the UK tax hikes potentially. Remote gaming duty proposed from 21% to 42%. From an online perspective, what are your initial thoughts?
Well, I have to say that when I first sat down to research the topic, I felt really quite defensive and very much of a firm view that increasing remote gaming duty was completely unfair and all wrong. I think being immersed in regulatory compliance on a day-to-day basis, I'm hyper aware of how much the Gambling Act review changes are costing operators in terms of implementation, limiting customer expenditure, and changes to other costs such as statutory levy. But now, having read a bit more about the subject, I do feel that gambling operators probably could afford to pay a slightly higher rate of tax, but nowhere near the 42 or 50% which has been proposed.
Yeah, like I said, we'll get into some details later, but I think that's a very fair initial view. And Poole, obviously from the land-based side, a similar doubling was proposed, but different numbers, 15 to 30%. In terms of a land-based perspective, what are your kind of initial takes?
Obviously, the main concern is entrepreneurial spirit and jobs. There's an enormous number of people employed in the betting industry in the UK, and it's unimaginable that doubling the tax from 15% to 30% wouldn't cost jobs somewhere down the line. The suspicion is it's not just jobs at stake. If the margins are getting thinned out that severely, then value to the customer is going to suffer as well. So you're going to end up with worse odds or thinner bonus offers, which effectively reduces the amount of time you get to play with any amount of money if you're a betting customer. So all the way around, it's tough for operators, tough for consumers, but then again, it looks like the books have got to be balanced somehow. So there's everybody, well, no sector wants to pay more tax, but a bunch of them are going to have to. It's a question of who takes the most pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair assessments. When it comes to how these reports kind of surfaced, obviously the kind of big news hit The Guardian. In terms of the methodology and how they kind of arrived to these numbers, and kind of instant doubling, I can maybe predict your responses. They might have been similar to mine. And I don't mind who starts, but what were your kind of initial thoughts on, wow, that's a rather high number that they've, well, almost precursoring the answer there, but how they arrived at those conclusions?
I mean, I have to admit, I haven't had a chance to read the reports in detail. I think generally continuing to align tax rates to products in terms of level of potential harm is a reasonable approach in principle, but I don't think it's been properly thought through, and I don't think much logic has been applied to get to those numbers, which seem to be, just quite round and easy to pick out from the sky. I think I disagree with the suggestion that this approach incentivizes operators to focus on lower harm kind of products. There's no way remote casino is going to switch tack and relaunch as a bingo provider. And what's more, if they did, the demand for casino products wouldn't go away. Instead, you just push those casino punters to other operators. And more worryingly, as the market inevitably constricts to the black market. I also think the think tanks haven't really considered other costs, which gambling operators are required to pay alongside tax. Examples include the horse racing levy and the statutory levy, and then for lotteries, good cause contributions as well.
Yeah, and Poole, do you kind of have any thoughts on this element of it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Kirsty referred to hasn't been thought through properly. I wonder, in the context of some of the other kind of leaked potential tax rises, whether what's happening now is part of the thinking through process. With the capital gains tax one springs to mind. I've seen a lot of fairly witless comments on LinkedIn about how it's going to destroy entrepreneurs if the CGT threshold or the CGT rate goes higher and they do away with entrepreneurs relief. I mean, both Kirsty and I kind of own our own company. So in theory, part of the end game, one day when we're too old to do it anymore, you sell the company and you get a large part of that money tax free, and that may or may not be abolished depending on whether these reports are true or not. And I think it does seem like it's leak the news or leak the potential news, see what the reaction is, and then determine what to do from there. And if you're going to do that, kind of classic anchoring negotiation posture, start with a massive number so that in theory, if you end up dropping the tax increment to a more sensible number, then everyone says, rather than saying like, holy cow, that's an extra whatever percentage of our winnings we've got to pay over, it's, wow, I'm glad it wasn't as high as it was originally suggested. It feels like a pretty basic negotiation tactic. But as I understand it, it's happened a number of times recently with kind of deliberate leaks just to gauge the temperature. And it feels like a bit of a manipulative way to do things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really fair point, especially kind of a segue into my next question, because the market's reacted, and I don't know if you guys have any specific thoughts on this, but immediately Flutter at the top of the market saw kind of a 5% share fall. Evoke really fell in Tane, the rank group, and just wondering, and it plays very much into that point of maybe as a negotiation tactic, but wondering what you guys made of how quickly the market reacted, given it was just a report at the end of the day, and maybe take turns, go to Poole first for this one.
I do wonder if, I think I'm right in saying most of them have recovered reasonably well, Evoke being an exception. So you wonder if the wider market, the global market, which these stocks are traded on, or certainly reacting to global sentiment, the share prices are, whether there's an element of the world that isn't used to this slightly odd leaking tactic and thought, like, holy cow, we're in a world of trouble here, we better dump these shares, without realising that it seems like it's a pretty routine ploy by the UK government, and including the Tory government just gone, and it's actually not anything to be worried about until you get a better idea of what they're actually going to do, rather than this big number they float out there to try and scare everybody.
Yeah, and Kirsty, over to you.
Yeah, and I think Paul makes a really good point, and I hadn't actually thought about it from that kind of perspective. But for me, I do think that there will be a change in the taxation rates for the gambling sector, and I think that the market activity reflected that kind of wider view that this is something which is going to come down the line, the levels of which we're not sure of yet, and obviously time will tell. When I was doing my research, I understand now that the level of taxation for gambling operators in the UK is probably quite low in comparison with a lot of other different countries. France, Greece, Denmark, a number of US states, for example, are all paying much higher rates of tax than we are in the UK. There have been quite a few recent examples of other markets hiking their taxes up. Sweden and the Netherlands spring to mind. And I think the fact that, that the funding for these proposals, or one of these proposals at least, has been linked with this major Labour Party donor, potentially means that these proposals hold more weight than perhaps some of the other leaked reports that are potentially being put out there to test the water.
Yeah, I think fair points. I think in terms of the Labour point, it's interesting that I think when Labour won the election, there was a general expectation that Labour kind of aligns with perhaps working class roots, so association with horse racing and greyhounds, and the gambling industry might have received more support than perhaps a Conservative government that was, I guess words like maybe sort of ambivalent towards gambling were kind of used. But this has kind of turned that a little bit, but as you say, because of a specific donor. Sort of, in my opinion, kind of what alluding to what you said earlier, Kirsty, the numbers of kind of just suddenly doubling a tax rate, kind of out of the sky. I would very much agree with that. But I guess the inevitable point that, as kind of we're all self-aware that we're in the gambling industry. Well, you guys certainly are, obviously, me being gambling media. There's a social cost to gambling. This will always kind of make it a potential target for tax rises. And just to use a couple of figures, Q1 NGR for Rank Group was up 12% to 197.5 million. In Tane with Rank Group's underlying operating profit for 23-24 was 46 million. Flutter reaching 3.61 billion in Q2 gross gaming revenue. These are huge figures, and effectively, my question based off the back of those figures is, Can the gambling industry really kind of plead poverty and say we can't necessarily afford these tax rises? Are we looking at, as you guys already mentioned, probably there will be a rise of some kind, and is that fair?
Go ahead, Kirsty.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, I don't think operators will plead poverty. I think what they'll do is cut costs in other areas, like Paul alluded to earlier. To offset that additional tax burden, that's probably going to be around bonusing, marketing, resources, content creation, all of the usual things. I think what's also important to remember is that in the UK, we're going through a really significant period of regulatory change at the moment. That's definitely going to impact operator profitability in the coming months and years. The introduction of stake limits, introduction of formalised financial risk checks, the RTS changes are going to be really expensive, getting those in place. And then obviously the increased levy costs. So whilst we look at those big numbers, they are group numbers rather than UK focused only numbers. They're probably not going to continue in the same vein over the coming months and years. And I think that probably needs to be taken into consideration as well.
So that's a really good point. With so much change imminent, throwing in another massive variable, it doesn't seem like a fair thing to do. My point on this would be that if we're talking about kind of the polluter pays principle, no one can deny that gambling is a product that has dangers for some people. The number of people who are negatively affected by gambling isn't zero. It has a cost, and it's right that the operators or people who profit from it, being the operators, should bear some part of the cost. But for me, it's not necessarily linked to how much money they make. I mean, a ton of industries make way more money than gambling, so to change the percentage of the sector specific profits that you make there has to be a reason behind it. The extent to which gambling is a dangerous product hasn't changed or won't change the day that the tax rate changes, so you need a much more detailed justification for why if you're going to take 30% instead of 15%, and link it to the fact that it's a polluter pays principle. What's the justification? Nothing. It hasn't got worse. So there's no direct link that you can say, well, that's why. So you need a much better justification than just, well, they're making some money, so we'll have a bit more of it. That doesn't stand up, because there's every other industry that makes money is in the same position.
And arguably, with the changes to the regulatory framework, the industry, the target is for there to be less harm caused as things tighten up. So actually, you're kind of going in the opposite direction to align with the polluter pays theory.
And then you add in the fact, and the extent to which this is true is open to debate and depends who you talk to. But if you're genuinely concerned about harm, and the reason for raising taxes as well as putting more money into the coffers is to reduce harm, there is no doubt that to some extent the reduction in value that the customer gets will drive some of them offshore, black market, and there's no protection, or there's arguably no protection at all there. So just if you're going to raise taxes, be honest about why. Don't try and hide it behind something that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, a fair point in terms of, I guess, as you say, bad timing because of a lot of other regulatory change, and certainly take the point on actualities, and that's something we've seen in other markets, for example, kind of in Sweden, where kind of regulators have come in with sort of tough policies, not necessarily thought about them, and the actual channelization effects, numbers are far lower than they want. If we were to look at potentially other industries that you could potentially generate more tax revenue from with a less steep rise, are there anyone that we could perhaps say this could qualify a little bit perhaps better than gambling? I don't know, Kirsty, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet, actually, about one particular industry, so I was really pleased to see this question. So, I mean, I posted on LinkedIn around 6 months ago a BBC article around Tesco's pre-tax profits, and they'd hit 2.3 billion, up from 882 million on the previous year. Yet it was still working hard to cut prices. And I I just can't get my head around how profits can increase so much during a cost of living crisis when they're selling products that you arguably have to buy, and this company doesn't qualify, or companies like it don't qualify for a significant hike in tax. I think from my reading, they paid around just under 24% in this financial year. So, I think that's a key one. And I think another really, really obvious one is the alcohol sector. And it would be something I would be looking at if I was in Rachel Reeves's position. I've read there's about 20,000 deaths in the UK every year attributed to alcohol. And the total cost of the economy relating to wider alcohol-induced issues, such as missed working days, is around 5 billion a year. And don't get me wrong, I like a drink. But from what I understand about alcohol taxation, most of the burden seems to be passed on to the consumer. Obviously, increasing rates would contribute to a reduction in consumption and a reduction in NHS costs as a result. But I also think that there should be consideration about increasing tax on alcohol producers or importers, given the problems excessive consumption causes across multiple areas of society.
That just given me a thought, actually, Kirsty. Having just got back from Vegas for the G2E show and the absolutely relentless stink of weed, maybe we just legalise weed and start taxing it. I mean, it's. I don't know how many states in the US have legalised it, but it's increasingly becoming decriminalised at least, and state-sponsored or state-permitted distribution. Certainly in Nevada, the dispensaries are everywhere. There's a ton of money to be made. I'm sure there are puritanical elements who believe it will be. I mean, would believe it will be best kept, whatever status it is now, illegal to distribute and supply. But it just feels like there's a ton of money to be made out of that from something that's going to happen regardless, and you can potentially have a little bit more protection in place for the consumer if it's all done on a licensed basis. It's almost the opposite situation to the gambling situation. Increased taxes in gambling push people to illegal operators. From a marijuana point of view, just make all the illegal operators legal and collect taxes. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're forming a little think tank of our own here, not just with gambling. I mean, yeah, really interesting ideas. I'm glad I kind of asked the question, because usually more my questions are 100% gambling related, but it provides a really nice segue actually into the next question I was going to ask, but I can almost link in kind of that alcohol and obviously at the moment weed isn't legal in the UK, but alcohol definitely is socially just accepted. Cigarettes had the advertising ban. Gambling, generally has a stigma associated with it, whereas alcohol, we view it differently. We kind of, rightly or wrongly, it's part of kind of not everyday culture, but social culture. Will gambling always be an easier target for tax rises because of that kind of acceptance of other industries and just popular opinion not necessarily favouring it in the UK?
I think it will, unless the industry gets a lot better at communicating with the mainstream media and being a lot more on the front foot rather than kind of reactive. I also think that the regulator has a part to play in this as well. I mean, ultimately, one of its core roles is to promote economic growth within the industry, and I think that should include ensuring that changes and improvements are publicly recognised. Often there's a real misconception about things like player protection controls represented in the media, and clearly that's a really emotive topic and one which should be more accurately reported if gambling as a whole is to kind of change its reputation and the perception of the public.
I'd argue on that point that the timescales are important as well. The online gambling's been with us however long, I wouldn't even like to guess, 20 years or thereabouts. The kind of changing public opinion genuinely across a timescale that relatively short is quite difficult. For the whole concept of is gambling socially acceptable or not? Well, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, going horse racing and having a bet would be considered fine. Going to bingo would be considered fine. In the public perception to the average Daily Mail reader, perhaps. But it's moved so fast in that space of time that it's morphed into something else, and not many people would say, I gamble online, I like playing on online casinos. That's just not I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that. They must be doing, because there's billions of pounds being made. I think that it's just going to take time for the perception to adjust. I mean, you read scare stories if you're involved in the gambling industry, as we all are, about the preponderance of gambling amongst college kids or college age kids, 18, 19, 20. Having a bet on the football is absolutely part of the culture. And when they get a little older and they become public opinion, then it'll be the picture will change a little bit, I'm sure. But I just think the timescales to change something as wide as a country's view, which is generally reflected and arguably driven by the media, that's decades. It's not just years.
Yeah, some already good ideas. I've got a final question coming up, but thanks to both for kind of exactly the kind of level of discussion that I was hoping for and expecting when kind of invited you guys on. In terms of final question, usually kind of like to look ahead with questions about targets or goals, but in this case, it's simply how realistic do you think this prospect now, given that we're discussing it and it's being discussed up and down the country, of an actual tax change, and given what you said earlier, Paul, about kind of it being a negotiation tactic, perhaps how big of a number that would be. Also considering the fact that the government did kind of downplay the reports last week a little bit, and we have seen some kind of good cases being made by the likes of Flutter CEO and the Betting and Gaming Council. So in short, kind of how likely do you think we are to seeing a tax raise at any given point?
I'd imagine that the plan will work. From a betting duty point of view, it's at 15. The scare story is 30, and that will just mean they can jack it to 20% without too much faff or without too much fuss, and people will just be, as I mentioned earlier, relieved that it's not 30. It feels like it's that. So the break point for that is it 4%, 5%, or 6% increment? It's not going to be all 15. It's not going to double from 15 to 30. It's not going to stay where it is, because otherwise they wouldn't have floated the idea in the first place. I'm guessing they're going to see the level of pushback and see how far they can tickle it and effectively get away with it.
Yeah, I haven't thought about a kind of specific number. I'm confident that we will see a rise in taxation for the remote sector. I'm also confident that it won't be 42 or 50%. Presumably it will sit somewhere, in between where we are now and those levels. I keep coming back to overlaying the regulatory environment over the top of these proposals, which is something I don't think has been done by the think tanks, and something which I hope the government will be very mindful of and will be taking into consideration when they're making these budget decisions.
Well, Kirsty and Paul, thanks to you both for obviously you featured on Gambling Insider before, but thanks very much for being on the Huddle and this particular topic. It's been something I've been sort of really keen to talk about since the report's broken, and thanks very much for adding a high level analysis to the topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
To our viewers, thanks for watching, and you can catch more Huddle action in our next episode.